Another nice addition to After Effects is the ability to add motion blur to already shot or already rendered footage. Now here's a little shot of a hummingbird shot with a Canon 5D, and unfortunately the shutter speed was too fast. It was set at 1/300th of a second, when it should probably have been, say, 1/50th or 1/60th of a second to get more of a motion blurred filmic look. As a result, the wings on the hummingbird look quite strobed and are a little bit jarring to watch. And if we were to single frame through this, I'll select the timeline panel and use page up and page down, you can see the wings do indeed move a fair amount from frame to frame. Sometimes they look still, sometimes they look blurred, and this is what creates a very jarring final image when it's at motion. Well, let's pick a place where the hummingbird's making a particular move, such as right here where it lunges into the feeder. To smooth out this movement, you can now use a brand new effect called Pixel Motion Blur. I can never remember what category it's in, so I'll just search inside the effects control panel. And there it is, underneath time, not underneath blur, Pixel Motion Blur. I'll add this to my layer, and now you'll see how the hummingbird has been changed and distorted a little bit to give some natural blur to the image. I'll go page up for one frame earlier, page down for one frame later, and now I get a much more fluid movement, blurred as the hummingbird lunges into the feeder. Now that his head stopped moving, you can see that portion of him is sharp again. Let's go ahead and queue up a RAM preview of this. You'll notice it's not necessarily the fastest effect in the world, so again, don't apply to every piece of footage, only use it when you need it. But once we have this playing back at full speed, and I'll jump ahead here in a moment, you'll notice that the final result is much smoother. And here we're playing back at full speed with the new pixel motion blurred footage. And you'll notice that it is a lot more fluid and a little bit easier to watch. I might even go for a little bit more blur in this to smooth it out even more. Now just for reference, this 7-second clip took a few minutes to render. So again, it's not an effect you apply lightly, but it can really make some footage more watchable. Now that we've looked at this, let's go study Pixel Motion Blur's parameters. They're pretty simple. Shutter angle, 180 degrees is the typical filmic look of a half-duty shutter on a film camera. If you want more blur, you can crank this up to particularly high numbers, such as 720, to create a very blurred looking image. But I'll go back to the filmic 180. Shutter samples is how many intermediate points in time After Effects is going to create to attempt to smooth out this image. For example, if I was to go down to shutter samples of only, say, 2, now we're going to see a lot more ghosting and more artifacts as it attempts to blur out this hummingbird. Not quite as nice looking. Particularly in here, you see a ghost of its back as it moves forward. But with more shutter samples, now it looks a bit smoother. You can go even higher to smooth it out even more. If you're still noticing strobing, go for a higher value. But keep in mind that more shutter samples takes longer to render. Finally is vector detail. This is actually derived from the time warp and pixel motion portions of After Effects that does what some people call optical flow. It takes pixels from the frame before and after and tries to calculate where those pixels would have been at intermediate points in time. The more vector detail, the tighter a mesh of pixels that are calculated. So if I'm having trouble with some distortion in the looks of this hummingbird, and let's find a frame a little bit earlier in time where things may be looking a bit odd or stretched, such as when he first lunges into the feeder. There, we've got some problems with the ghost of the wing there. You can try increasing the vector detail to get a cleaner render of the image. Again, it's not a parameter that you just blindly increase to see if it looks better, because 1, it's going to take longer to render, and 2, it can introduce artifacts of its own, but you can see where it has cleaned up the render of this single frame, compared to the default value, which is now looking a little bit distorted by comparison. And again, you really should look at these things at speed, rather than looking at one frame at a time. A lot of sins you see on individual frames are forgiven by the eye when everything is put together in full motion. Now, Pixel Motion Blur is not an entirely new effect. There's been third-party solutions. There's been a solution inside After Effects. You could go to Effect, Time, Time Warp, change the speed to 100%, enable Motion Blur, and change the shutter control from automatic to manual, and you'll get a very similar effect to using the Pixel Motion Blur effect. The nice thing about Pixel Motion Blur is it's now in one simple effect instead of this big effect you had to set up by hand. So, another way of rescuing poorly shot footage in After Effects.